Hi there, welcome back for our final week of our In the Waiting study. This is it. We've done it or are about to do it if you've still got a little bit of reading left. But this is the final video. This is our final time together in our study of waiting. And I can't think of any better place to end than to give you some comfort and to remind you that you are not alone. You see, waiting has a funny way of isolating us, has a way of making us feel like nobody quite understands what we're going through, or that we're somehow on the outside because we're still waiting on something that everybody else seems to have. And I want you to know as we leave this space that even if during these 40 days your waiting hasn't ended, you are not alone. One of my favorite things to do is to hear and read and absorb the stories of others who have gone before me in the faith. There's something about a person's testimony and their journey of walking with God that just encourages me in my own journey. Sometimes I find that encouragement and that sort of camaraderie in Christian fiction. Other times I find it in biographies or memoirs. And one of my favorite biographies I have read is about George Mueller. If you're unfamiliar with George Mueller, he was a guy that lived in Bristol, England. I think, don't quote me on the date, but I think in the 1800s, early 1900s. I think it's early 1900s. And he committed his life to serving God. And for a while, he was a pastor, and then he felt the nudge from God to stop taking a paycheck from the church, and felt the nudge from God to start an orphanage to care for children who didn't have a home. And all the while, there was this permeating thread of God saying, George Mueller, I want you to trust me absolutely for provision. So Mr. Mueller spent a good majority of his life asking God and only God to provide for his needs. He never made his financial needs known to anybody else. He didn't really have a normal job or normal income. It was all God. Everything he needed, he went to prayer, he asked the Lord to provide, and God always, always came through. There have been seasons in my own life where part of my waiting has been connected to financial provision. I needed God to come through to cover the bill for a writing project, or to cover my grocery money, or to cover tuition when I was in college. Having George Mueller's story to fall back on, I underlined his biography and I've gone back and read sections of it multiple times, but having his story has reminded me that I'm not alone, and the things I'm waiting on are not unique. There are others who have gone before us, who have waited, who have seen God's provision and seen him come through, and also those who have left this earth waiting, still waiting on God to do that thing. So today I want to take you to another passage that might be familiar. We're not going to read the whole thing, but we are going to talk about it a little bit and focus in on one particular piece of this passage, and that is Hebrews 11. We talked last week about the love chapter being 1 Corinthians 13, and Hebrews 11 is often called the faith chapter, or the Hall of Faith instead of Hall of Fame. And throughout this chapter, it details the waiting and the faith of people who waited, people who are well known in Scripture, people like Abel and Noah and Abraham and Sarah, Rahab, the people of Israel, Moses. All of these people waited. They had this individual wait in each of their lives. Abraham and Sarah wanted a child. Moses was waiting for the freedom of his people. Rahab was waiting for rescue from Jericho before the walls fell. But there was a thread of waiting that tied all of these people together, and none of them saw the fullness of the waiting come to pass. They all died still waiting. And what they were waiting for was the coming of God's kingdom, the restoration of full relationship with God, restoring the life God created for us to be with us, and the life that we had chosen to cast aside when humanity sinned in the garden. If you're ever doubting that others haven't walked through waiting like this is a good chapter to meditate on. It's a good chapter to treat almost as a wrap-up of our whole study together, because many of the people talked about in this passage we've studied throughout this entire book. So if you get to a point down the road where you need another reminder about these people who waited and how God showed up and how you can draw near to God in the waiting, this is a good place to go. But for today's purpose, we're going to dive in to a small piece of this chapter. We're going to read verses 13 through 15. And I hope you find encouragement here. It's kind of a weird passage to focus on, but we're here for a purpose. So let's read. Hebrews 11, verses 13 through 15. These, meaning all the people we've talked about in Hebrews 11, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who spoke thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. These few verses come specifically around talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the call God put on them to leave their homeland and to enter a land he would show them. And the author of Hebrews is comparing that waiting with the waiting they had in their souls, where their souls were longing for a new land, a good land, a land where God is present and relationship is restored and God's kingdom is fully here on earth. I don't know about you, but there's a piece of this that is slightly comforting for me. It reminds me that people have waited all throughout history. People have waited on God to act. And we have spent the last 40 days studying the people who waited and how God responded. But with that, there were also people who waited who didn't get what they wanted, who didn't see the fulfillment of their waiting. And that's okay. It reminds me that I'm not alone. It reminds me that even if God's answer to my wait is no, even if I never get that thing I'm waiting on, I'm not alone. I want to read you another passage that is in the next chapter of Hebrews. Hear this as a benediction. Hear this as a closing word of encouragement to keep going, to keep waiting on God, to keep trusting Him, to keep pressing into love, to keep finding your strength in Him, to keep bravely waiting for God. Hebrews 12, 1 through 2. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, all of those people detailed in Hebrews 11, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race set before us, looking to Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Dear heart, we are not alone in the waiting. We have a whole legacy of faithful people who waited on God, who remained faithful even when they didn't get what they were waiting for. And we have Jesus. Jesus, the one who knows waiting, the one who is with us in the waiting, and the one who will ultimately bring all of this waiting to an end. We, like the people before us, are waiting for God's kingdom. Our personal waits, we may see them come about, we may not. But the one thing we are guaranteed is Jesus will return. That waiting will end, and God's kingdom will come. And that thing, all of humanity, all of our souls have been longing for, we will finally get to see. Dear heart, I hope this study has encouraged you. I hope that you have learned who God is and that He is with you in the waiting. And I pray that as you continue to move forward, whether your waiting season is over or it's just beginning, I pray that you continue to hope in the Lord, that you press into Him, that you wait for Him, and that you expect Him to show up and be good to you, because He is. He is good, and He is trustworthy, and He is here with us always. In the waiting, when we're not waiting, and as we look toward the day when we are no longer waiting for Him to come because He has come. Blessings on your journey, dear heart. May you continue to love God, love His story, and live devoted. Thanks for studying with me.